Hi, I'm Susan Krause-Kemp, and we're going to talk about doing a white ground for encaustic painting. There's a couple methods for doing this. One, you can use a new white ground that R&F Paints has developed to paint on your board. Other grounds that are used for acrylic and oil painting are not applicable for encaustic because the wax will not adhere to those grounds. Another method is to glue watercolor paper to a hard board and use the watercolor paper as your ground. So in this video, I'm going to show you a method for gluing watercolor paper to a hardboard to create a white ground for your painting. To start off, gather the tools that you're going to need. In this example, I'm going to use untempered masonite that's pre-cut to the size I want to paint, heavyweight cold press watercolor paper, some paper which can be newsprint for applying the glue and for compressing the board and the paper, something to cut with, something to brush your surface clean with, some shims for applying the glue and for pushing out the air bubbles, and something heavy to add weight so that they will glue together properly. You also need a glue. This glue should be a PVA glue. This one's pH neutral, and I bought it at a bookmaker's bookbinding store. PVA glue is really just like Elmer's glue, and you can use Elmer's glue, but it's nice to find one that's professional and is acid-free. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to take my board, which is untempered masonite, make sure it's free of any dust, and we're going to glue the cold press watercolor paper, the smoother side to the smoother side of the board. I'm going to lay my board down and I'm going to cut not exactly to size, a little bit bigger than the size I want. This is a rotary cutting knife. Works very nicely for this purpose. Okay, now I want to put some paper down, lay my piece of watercolor paper down, and put a generous coating of glue on it. It takes more glue than you might expect, and don't worry about putting too much glue down. You're going to scrape off the excess. These shims are just cut from mat board, and they have a nice straight edge on them, and you use this edge to spread the glue in a nice even layer across the surface of the watercolor paper. You want a nice thick even layer. Make sure your paper doesn't move around while you're doing this, because you don't want to get any glue on the underside of the paper. As you can see, the paper is going to want to buckle once it gets some of the glue onto the surface. Carefully pick up your paper, remove your sheet, put down another clean sheet, set your paper back down, and because you didn't cut the paper exactly to the size of the board, make sure you put the smooth side to the glue. You don't have to line things up perfectly. Flip the board over, and then take your second shim, which should not have any glue on it, and use it to make sure that you've smoothed out any air bubbles and get the glue moving all the way to the edge. It's going to want to have a tendency to press up a little bit on the edges. Once you have it shimmed and you're sure you don't have any bubbles underneath, I actually like to flip it back over with the paper side down, and you can stack multiple layers up, so you can put 4 or 5 boards down at once, and then take a number of books, or one really heavy book like this one, and just lay it down and let it sit for, I like to let it sit for a minimum of 2 hours, but usually at least 4 hours, and it really depends on the climate you're in. If you're in a really wet climate, it probably has to sit much longer than in a dry climate, and I'm in Colorado, so I don't have to let it sit quite as long. Okay, it's been plenty of time. Let's take the dictionary off. You see it's nicely sealed to the board. Now I'm just going to take my cutter. You can use an X-Acto knife, this is a rotary cutter, and trim the board, the paper to the board. I like these rotary cutters because they roll nicely along the edge of the board. And there you have it, watercolor mounted on hardboard.